Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the climate stream at PAW. Thank you so much for joining. I'm really excited for this second of our panel discussions. We are really pleased to have 4 distinguished experts on this panel, and I'll quickly introduce them, and then they can give a little bit more introduction about themselves and their work and how they think about the space of machine learning and climate tech. We have Dr. Amy Luers, who is the global lead for sustainability science at Microsoft. Previously, she served as executive director of Future Earth, assistant director for climate resilience and information at the White House in the Obama administration, director of climate at the Skull Global Threats Fund, and senior environment manager at Google. Dr. Luers holds a PhD in environmental science and an MA in international policy studies from Stanford University. Dr. Sekou Remy is research scientist and challenge lead at IBM Research Africa. Previously, he held teaching and research appointments at Clemson University, the University of Notre Dame, and Spelman College. Dr. Remy holds a PhD in electrical and computer engineering from Georgia Tech. Dr. Leah Boche is the technical leader of the generation sector at the Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI, a nonprofit organization that conducts research, development, and demonstration projects focused on electricity generation and delivery. Prior to this role, Dr. Boche served as a technical leader for AI at EPRI, and she earned her Doctor of Engineering in Power Plant Optimization and a Diplom in Energy and Process Engineering from Technische Universität Berlin. Dr. Ignacio Zuleta serves as head of remote sensing at the agriculture technology company Indigo Ag. Previously, he worked for 6 years at the satellite imagery company Planet Labs and as a postdoctoral researcher at UCSF. Dr. Zuleta holds a PhD in physical chemistry from Stanford University. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today.
Yeah, great to meet all of you. Basically, we would love to hear. Can you tell us a little bit about your work and how do you see the overall potential of machine learning applied to climate tech? Maybe let's start with Ignacio.
Hey, nice to meet you all. So, as we heard before, I'm a person that has found itself to be very passionate about systems, and I'm joining Indigo here to try to work on 2 different goals. One is trying to map globally regenerative agricultural practices. And of course, weather tech is going to be one of the biggest inputs into agriculture. So there's a big theme of mapping resilience. And then the other thing that to me is very near to my heart is bridging people from different disciplines. So we can really tackle these big systems problems. I find a lot of the barriers are between generational and professional disciplines and cultures. So this is my new challenge. I only been in this position for about a month and a half. Very excited to join the panel to discuss more.
Fantastic. And maybe Ignacio, maybe you can tell a little bit about what Indigo is doing in climate.
Well, right now we're users of climate data. So the main input and output that we can produce is information and insight on the impact of regenerative agricultural practices on the resilience to climate events. This is just to be very specific, one of the areas. Of course, weather and climate are very important inputs into machine learning models where we can help disambiguate parameters we're trying to invert in terms of reconstructing what's going on in a farm at a global scale. But to me, the very interesting aspect is going to be tracking, essentially in a geographically resolved fashion, what is the impact of the practices that farmers are deploying right now to support carbon sequestration and sustainability on resilience, economic resilience to weather and climate change.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There's clearly a lot of resilience to be developed, and yeah, agriculture will definitely be threatened by climate damages. So yeah, thank you for that work. Amy, on to you. Can you tell us a bit about your work? And
Sure. Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me, David. So as David said, I'm the global lead for sustainability science at Microsoft, and it's a new program that I was brought on to develop. Which is super exciting to know that a tech company like Microsoft really recognizes the importance of bringing in sustainability science along data science, machine learning to tackle these different issues. as the context of the work that we do here, so Microsoft has made a big commitment to not just become climate negative, but actually to reduce all of the emissions that we have put into the company since we started back in the 1970s. And so a big part of that is thinking about the sustainability science, the natural world, as well as how technology can help us get there and monitor and manage our pathway to that, that outcome. And so we also don't just work on climate, but have a holistic view of sustainability. So we have targets to be water positive, zero waste, and protect more land than we use by 2030. So we see this as an integrated piece, and which is an exciting thing for me because I'm an ecosystem scientist by training. And the challenge I have is to work with our team and work in the policy realm, the technology realm. How can we do this and get the science right? And a lot of that is actually doing research and asking questions to say, you know what, this we can't do quite right yet, but we got to figure out these problems so that we can do it right. And we want to share what we learn and move forward together.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Amy. I guess, how do you see the overall potential for ML being applied to climate tech? And I guess the role that you see Microsoft playing in that picture.
Yeah, I think that, you know, one of the areas that I think there's a huge opportunity is thinking about how we monitor, manage, and govern the natural world. And in the context of climate risks, for example, one of the things I've worked on climate risk management for a long time, and initially it was very much in a city level or a very local based level. But increasingly the risks that we see are interconnected risks, and you can't really look at either sustainability issues more broadly, but certainly climate risks in an isolated setting. So being able to understand and manage those systems risks, those integrated risks, I think is really critical for machine learning. The other issue is in the context of, for example, right now, a big part of our work is carbon removal. Not because we're not reducing, we are reducing and moving to clean energy and are 100% renewable at the moment. But the real challenge is we've committed to removing 100% of our emissions since our start. That means we need to invest in the natural landscapes. We're also investing in technologies, but that's not going to come on board at a reasonable scale for a long time. So that means we need to understand how to manage carbon in our landscape. And so in soils, in different areas, it's really hard to be able to collect data at the scale and spatial and temporal resolution that you need to in the field to solve these problems. So combining remote sensing field work with AI and machine learning is an opportunity to be able to fill some of those gaps and scale this in an operational way.
Got it. Yeah, thank you, Amy. Sounds like you see a lot of potential in remote sensing and monitoring, both for quantifying the amount of carbon sequestered, for example, in certain natural projects, and for quantifying risk. Yeah, this makes sense. Really important areas. Okay. Leah, what's your take? Can you tell us a bit about your work and I guess the role of AI you see in it?
So I think I come from a more traditional mechanical engineering background. I worked for a German utility for 7 years, developing software for them for their power plants. And then about 5.5 years ago, started working for the Electric Power Research Institute, which is a nonprofit out of the US, but works worldwide. I think we have like 430 members worldwide, utilities. We're members of this organization. And I think what makes us different is our approach to a holistic view of the power industry. We're not looking only at fossil fuels. We're looking at the whole set of generation, transport, and down to the end consumer. I work in the generation part, both in renewable and fossil generation. And I think due to my background, coming from classic engineering and then moving into software development, I'm kind of the translator between the engineers and the software developers, helping them understand what the other one's saying. And do a lot of consulting for our program managers and project managers to help them identify what machine learning solutions might be the right ones for their problems. And I do projects myself as well, so I lead projects and I do some of the consulting. Lately, it's been interesting because there's a shift in how we apply machine learning. It used to be for plain time series data analytics, but we're starting to morph things into each other. We're using all the information we're gathering in the field, all the written information, and using more natural language processing. So that's been something that I started to look into over the last couple of years. It's really interesting and fascinating, and how we can combine that with time series data. And also I'm not really working a whole lot in the space of climate tech, but we have a lot going on there as well. We have groups that are specialized in that and doing satellite imagery analysis to evaluate the state of areas, application of rooftop photovoltaic and things like that. So I think all types of machine learning that are currently out there in the industry are being applied somewhere within the power industry.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I would not have guessed that there is even a place for natural language processing in the power industry.
Oh, plenty. Like, people write a lot. When we send out workers in the field, they type down what they're doing, and it's their language is how they process information. And so we have to figure out a way to standardize that and make that applicable and analyzable for us. And that's where we bring in NLP.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you. Okay, on to Dr. Sekou. What's your take? Can you tell us?
Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to those who are ahead in the time zones. I think I'm probably the newest to climate in this panel, but it's actually an interesting pivot for me. At IBM Research, there's a focus, and there has been a focus on climate in a few different key ways. So I'm one of about 4,000 researchers, about 19 locations, and IBM is broad. So there are physical chemists, there are people who, like myself, are electrical engineers, the software engineers. It's broad. But I think the question that within research we're trying to understand is, where is the most effective way to provide value for our clients? So IBM Research is really focused on understanding what's the need, what's the opportunity. There's a lot of ML that can be applied to do things like put my face on somebody else's body, or to animate things. But one of the questions that we're really asking is that the most effective use of that technology? It can be done, but should it be done? That's one of the questions that's on deck. Like I mentioned, I'm new to climate, but I'm coming from healthcare. There, the questions were slightly different, but it's actually all under the same umbrella. What's the most effective use, or what's the most effective context under which we can support a client's end goals or their use cases? So in some cases, it may be helping people, helping a researcher modernize their workflow so that they can run at scale in a manner that makes their work practical or feasible. In other cases, and some people don't know that IBM, the weather company, is an IBM company. So in other cases, it's actually tapping into the assets in our weather operations center and showing how that can add value, whether it's across the supply chain, or it's agriculture, or it's logistics. So there are a few different ways, and it's really all driven by customer need and the relationship that we have with our clients.
Makes sense. And Sekou, maybe could you maybe say a few words about what are some of the things that IBM Research is doing that are relevant to climate?
Right. So there are some of the things that I can talk about. I mean, there are things that we've published around carbon capture. There are things that we're looking at in terms of optimization of workflows in a climate-aware way. There are elements of the applications of things like image recognition, object detection, whether it's directly to support, like, let's say, a utility or somebody in the transportation industry. There are real questions around data, managing their data, understanding how to extract the value out of the data, estimating something like how heavy is the vegetation under a power line so that you can then predict what's the likelihood of effect or impact when comes the fire season. These are types of things that are being explored in different areas across our labs.
Makes sense. Yeah. Thank you, Sekou. On to David.
Thank you so much, all of you. I have a question tailored specifically for Amy in this case. What do you see as the kinds of stakeholders that have to come together for impactful climate tech? And what can be done to facilitate the creation of those partnerships and conversations?
So thank you, David. I mean, at first I want to sort of step back and make sure that I think of climate tech in the context of tackling the problem. So I can't really isolate that from the broader problem. So I'm going to answer the question, how do you, what kind of partnerships are needed to address this, and how does climate tech fit into it? You know, I've had the opportunity to work on climate from a number of different angles for the last 20 years, from academia, from government, from the private sector, from civil society as an advocate. And one thing that I've been really taken about is that there's really very little that one of these sectors can do alone. And so how pivotal these partnerships are. So I've really pretty quickly in my career focused on building partners, building public-private partnerships, building groups of people who really approach this issue from very different angles. And the value of that is not just that we can leverage all these different sectors to work together, but the value is also that each of those groups come and see this problem in such different ways. And we need to see the problem in such different ways to be able to characterize what problem we're solving, but also to understand different options or opportunities for addressing them. And I think that in terms of what we can do together in these different groups, I think in the context of research, I think even setting research agendas is important to think about. If we really are focusing on research for action that's going to drive change, I think that we need to think about these research agendas together. And another area that I've been really focused on in the last couple of years is really thinking about, well, how do we focus the community on developing operational insights and making those happen so that we can change how we do policy. So in the climate world, and in the ecosystem world, we have essential variables, which are essential variables. What do we need to monitor in the world to be able to understand how biodiversity is changing? What do we need to monitor in the world to understand how the climate is changing or how the ocean is doing? Scientific community has done that and has a system of organizing to do that. You know, could it be better? Does it need more resources? Yes, but there is a process that's done that. What I think is an opportunity for our community to sort of organize around it. What are the essential actionable insights for policy and for action? I don't think that we've sat down together and said, there's one is how do you monitor the world, understand it's changing, but what about what actions could you take? What policies could you do if we actually had this information? One, that comes to mind is, timely emissions of different sectors, right? And that's kind of on the horizon. Right now, our tracking of emissions is mainly that feeds into policy is mainly voluntary bottom-up processes, which is kind of all over the map. doesn't really add up. But if you had that kind of information, and if we all focus and said, okay, let's get that really well in a way that could be legitimate for a policy process, then that could actually change how we monitor and manage it, how we implement policies, how we implement the economy. And so if we could sit down and organize around figuring out what are those essential actionable insights, and make that happen. I mean, that's just an example of how I think and I think that how you do that, how you would get around something like that, I think it's really important to have from the beginning sort of a small group of multi-stakeholders that sit in the various things that all have the credibility to bring people together, so no one group owns it. And that group has to be, I think, at the scale of the problem. So anyway, those are some thoughts that come to mind with that question.
Thank you. Absolutely. I think that's a really great way to frame how much it's not just about sort of building climate tech tools. It's about developing them and deploying them in such a way that they actually are going to have the intended impact and what is necessary in framing the broader picture in order to enable that kind of impact.
Yeah, the space is really multidisciplinary, and basically like almost all of the talks in the conference highlight how important it is to like understand the real world implications of what you're building and to like account for how the systems you're working with actually work. Like to me personally, this makes the space fascinating. Like, machine learning people and engineers love learning new spaces, and here you get to learn like a whole spaces outside of software and machine learning when you work with people who know how to deploy this technology. So the next question, it's for you, Sekou. So you worked in machine learning applied to healthcare as well as to climate change adaptation. So as a computer scientist and electrical engineer, what does it look like to develop ML tools with ultimate societal benefit in mind? And are there ways in which it might differ from standard practice in ML?
So that's a really awesome question, and it's something that I reflect on quite a bit. So here's how I'd answer it. Each of us, not just the panel, but everyone listening in, seeks to have impact, and we try to learn what's the best way to apply the things that we know in a manner that has value, that basically your presence can be felt. For some, that's a high citation count. For others, it's a publication at NeurIPS. For those of you still trying to make that deadline. For others, it's the amount of revenue. For others, it's like eyeballs, like how many people are seeing that product, that thing that you did. But at the end of the day, like, you have to do good work, right? There's another dimension of impact. This is, how does that thing that you do impact the quality adjusted life years for an individual who might benefit from it? Right? These things matter. So some of my colleagues in South Africa worked with the Gauteng province and the Wits University to generate a public dashboard to help track and predict the spread of COVID-19. Right? So it was one of those things. I mean, you can Google it, you can check it out. It's not enough just to say that the algorithms work. But the question is, are the algorithms getting to the root of the problems that they're there to benefit? So this notion of societal benefit is also difficult to quantify, but it's top of mind, right? Right now in ML, everybody's talking about it. Every conference has a track. But I would say, but at the core, it's still the same ML that's there before. But now it's seeking to put faces and names to the outcomes of the work that's done. Right? It forces practitioners to actually understand users and understand the workflows that their tech, their work has the ability to influence. So it's not just about data or points on a map that you don't know exactly where they are, right? It's about real people. So it's a paradigm shift that I agree, and this echoes some of the thoughts that you were saying earlier. It makes ML more interesting. So it's cool that you can improve the state of the art by 1%. But it's even better to be able to follow on and say that here's the impact of that 1% for Laura in Wichita or Fiona in Mombasa, right? So it's not just about a number, it's about a person, it's about an experience, it's about the knock-on effects for that activity. So I'd like to raise that this approach to ML does require skills outside of vector calculus and outside of software engineering. But at the end of the day, it makes the work that we're doing more meaningful, more valuable.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, Sekou. Thank you. And if I'm not mistaken, in other engineering fields, like people are sort of more used to the real world implications of their work. So like it's time for machine learning to also join that crowd. On to David.
Following on from that question, and I loved your answer, Sekou. For Lea and Ignacio, maybe you can take this in turn. So both of you work with large, established, often slow-moving players. In the case of Lea, that's, for example, electric grid operators and other stakeholders in the power sector. In the case of Ignacio, that's agriculture companies and other stakeholders. So how do these players regard machine learning tools, and what's the pipeline like for adoption of those tools? Leah, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So yeah, they're slow paced. That's what they're used to because they're typically dealing with different types of assets that are development is much slower. If you want to develop a new turbine blade, that just takes years, if not decades. So we're used to a slower pace. The policies have a slower pace. And for the application of machine learning in that field, it is not quite as slow. We're gaining traction there, but I don't think that the slow pace is necessarily bad. It just means that we're doing our due diligence before we throw something at our data and potentially at our assets. Optimizing them, going closed loop is something that gives everybody a little bit of a headache and requires a lot of due diligence beforehand. And I think that is what is perceived as slow pace, but I think it's just being rigorous about what we do because we cannot afford failures as much as, if you look at Texas, that's something, things like that happening are catastrophical and can cost lives. So we have to be more rigorous with the applications of software tools and tools in general in our space. And I think the skepticism towards those tools is going away. And we're seeing much more ask for digital solutions, especially since they've all broadened their base. We all have now, most utilities have different types of assets running. It's fossil and renewables in a mix, and you got to get that together somehow. And machine learning solutions are a good way.
Fantastic. I mean, that really, you really justify why players are being cautious, and rightly so. If you're, any kinds of mistakes or things that one doesn't understand in one's model cause power to go out. Ignacio, what's your take on this?
There's so many things we could discuss. I think there's a couple of dimensions. I think just to get it out of the way, the concept of velocity of adoption in agriculture, I think the divide is more between a hyper-local stance that farmers have than resistance to technology. I think they're highly technified, they're entrepreneurs, they're innovators, they're in contact and they understand weather and the environment around them, right? So I don't think there is a resistance to adoption of technologies. It's just a different stance towards interpersonal relationships and decision making. The main obstacle for machine learning generally to be deployed is a stance that is, I would call it a read-only philosophy, right? There's a lot of tradition of exploratory data analysis in data science and machine learning. And the big change that I'm trying to push, at Indigo and in other places is using machine learning in an operational environment to drive decisions that do have consequences. That requires putting a very high bar on the quantitative and scientific outputs of machine learning, because you need to manage the uncertainty and the downsides of getting the decisions wrong when you start plugging that into money decisions, right? Mm-hmm. So just to be a practical example from aerospace, where I spent many years, is you would never run machine learning in a control loop to fly an airplane, right? You crash it. So it's very powerful. The models are hyper local. There's always questions about the portability, uncertainty, and a lot of the work we're doing is really incentivizing people to make decisions. And if the work comes from machine learning, ultimately you're building financial derivatives in the case of sustainability, carbon credits, for example, or water conservation credits or whatever. So ultimately you're building a form of insurance. You're putting money in the loop. You need now something that is closer to a model-based interpretation of the environment and where you're at to create that picture where you are. And it has to be fully traceable because it has to withstand commercial and governmental disputes, right? It cannot be exploratory in a way. Mm-hmm. So we really need to think about machine learning, about something that sits in between more of an operations research systems engineering type of stance, where you can be right most of the time with several nines, right? And if you're not going to be right with several 99.999, time of the time, often, right? Then you have to figure out what's wrong, right? And so that's one of the biggest obstacles I see. The other one is global deploy of these models, right? You train them in a geography, they don't work in another. These are global problems. These are global problems that require global solutions, and they're data scarce. And machine learning is used to data-rich problems. So anyhow, I'm going to stop there. But there's a lot we could discuss about the real obstacles, to deploy of these techniques.
Yeah, thank you, Ignacio. There's definitely a lot more to sort of getting things right when applying ML to real-world problems with real financial impact. And we saw a number of speakers talk about it before. So, like Kairos said that they cannot tolerate false positives when you attribute a methane leak to equipment that's not yours. Or a Fresh spoke about how they need to quantify the uncertainty in demand planning for grocery stores. Because otherwise, they might run out of product that has real money impact. My next question is for Amy. Amy, Microsoft is clearly at the forefront of sustainability among big tech. But what role do you see Microsoft and other big tech companies playing in the climate tech ecosystem more broadly in the next decade? Where do you see big tech companies relative to the companies specializing in climate tech and public sector efforts in climate tech?
Well, it seems to me that it's clear that the digitalization is going to be parallel to the sustainability transformation, climate being part of that circle. And so while it's really important to have the tech community have a component of it that's really focused on tech, focus on climate specifically, I think that the companies like Microsoft will be really critical in terms of helping steer transform businesses and governments into more climate-friendly business models and operations. And so one of the things that we do, my team works to support our company's strategy towards being climate negative, but also working with lots of different companies that come to us to say, help us with our digitalization plan on sustainability issues. And I think increasingly governments are also doing that. You can see that in the EU, they talk about the twin transformations, digitalization and sustainability. So this integration, of course, is seen as much more central. And so I think that the companies like Microsoft have a key role to play for that just broad, rather not so much one problem, but how do you actually transform the systems that are the baseline of business models and of operations of governance. And I would like to see that also in the context of businesses are transforming their business models. I think governance has to reimagine itself also to fully take advantage of the digital and ML in particular for how we can address these problems.
Mm-hmm.
This is in the context of this, critical part of that, of course, is that the tech sector becomes net zero, because as we scale, we also will have a big input if we do that. I think there is a lot. I mean, Microsoft's doing a tremendous amount in that space, and as I said earlier, trying to figure out how to do that right. And a big part of that, the sort of easy part is our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, but the hard part is Scope 3, and that's the biggest part of our emissions. And so we really need to work in this ecosystem to be able to address that. And then that all of a sudden becomes, if increasingly large part of the community is online, then increasing part of the globe is part of our Scope 3 emissions. So we need to work with folks to solve this problem, to get our budget down. And as Satya, our CEO, says, we need to solve this problem for the world. For us to do well, the world has to do well. And I really do believe that, especially for the tech sector.
For those in the audience who maybe aren't familiar with the term Scope 1 through Scope 3, could you define Scopes 1, 2, and 3? Yeah.
So Scope 1 is in our operations. So all the emissions that are responsible, that are within our own operations. Scope 2 is the energy that we bring in, that might get some out well, but still all of it's kind of within our control, if you will. So that's why it's kind of, I say, the easy part. Scope 3 is the value chain, the supply chain from up and downstream. So people who use our products, the things that we bring in. And so we have less control over those emissions, but recognize, of course, they're part of the impact that we have on the world.
Fantastic. I think that very often that is neglected. Considering that tech is a magnifier, it's often really easy to think about sort of direct energy use or something like that, not what it's being used for. So, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, really simplified, but thinking about the overall societal impacts of what something's being used for is really, really important. So I love that takeaway.
Part removal is actually, because we do influence that. We have a carbon tax internally, and we have a carbon fund investing in things. So these are the two avenues where we get resources. And we are now putting a carbon tax on our suppliers. Awesome. But there's still a limit of what you could do without doing removal.
Yeah, and Amy, I really liked basically your take on this, the role digitalization plays in this whole thing. Basically, before we can, automate carbon accounting or offsetting and other things, like first there needs to be a platform to build on, and like that's clearly like so much of the world's business runs on Microsoft's products, yeah, so basically, like when I entered climate tech, I really got an appreciation for the stuff that businesses run on. Like I used to sort of like look down on it a little bit compared to the very interesting, big data and ML problems. But then you get a new appreciation for it when you see that like you need that groundwork to actually make stuff happen in the real world. Yeah, thank you.
I have a related question to follow up on this. So I would be interested, Sekou, your thoughts. So the problems that the tech community works on often get defined in Silicon Valley, and many of the speakers that we've seen in this overall conference have been from Silicon Valley or with companies that are based in Silicon Valley. As climate tech becomes more popular, there's the potential this serves to reinforce existing tech sector dynamics. For example, consolidating power for US-based tech players. And also a focus on problems that are more of relevance to California, like wildfires in the case of climate change adaptation, than to problems that might be relevant more to, say, East Africa, like locusts. What do you see as some of the dangers and opportunities here?
Well, thank you for this question as well. As a research scientist based in Kenya, this question is front and center. But let's start with data, right? When you think about the resources that are invested into data, data collection, data curation, and in essence, those things are applied generally where there is a way to monetize that investment or otherwise reward it, right? They always say follow the money. There's true merit to that. So again, I mentioned the weather company is an IBM company, so I'm picking on one of my own colleagues' concept. But companies like the weather company have 1 billion sensors around the globe, and there are satellites orbiting constantly, but some places are covered at different resolutions than others in both time and space, right? So if you don't have enough data describing phenomena that's happening in a certain location in the world, it's difficult to understand what the right intervention could be to cope with that issue there, right? But now linking it back to your question, if climate tech is driven from a place where the context of what's happening on the ground isn't fully understood, right? Context. If that is not understood, the wrong kind of solutions or the wrong approaches will be derived. And I do mean will be derived. Strong, strong, strong statement, right? You have to understand the context of the problems you're solving. Right? Must, right? But further, there's another risk. And that risk, and it echoes some of the questions that we were talking about earlier, this notion of being compounding, right? So resources are allocated to problems which are known. So if you're not monitoring what's happening with water in northern Kenya, Turkana, right? It's an ASL region. Then you won't know that you need to do research to address a specific problem being experienced there, right? But that said, I've also seen work done in northern Kenya, which was able to generate insights which were applied in California, right? So I am definitely a proponent for the climate tech community to listen to all of the voices, because solutions can come from places that might have been overlooked in time past. So that's how I view this.
Yeah, that's very true, Sekou. And yeah, clearly, basically, again, this brings me to the theme in my mind that like professionals from big tech entering the area, on one hand, they need to become more aware of other domains, but on the other hand, they also need to escape the Silicon Valley bubble and recognize that like what is on their mind as potential solutions they might work on, like they need to look wider than that and think what are the solutions that are not on their mind, and talk to the people in the actually affected regions. And they will have a lot more impact that way. So our next question is for Leah. So what challenges do you see in the space regarding data sharing and ownership, and how can they be alleviated? I know that it seems to be a particular challenge in the energy space. I've seen a bunch of efforts pop up. Wondering what's your take?
So we've seen a lot, the discussions over the last few years with our members on sharing data with us. While our projects have been lengthy and involved a lot of legal back and forth. And for us, that meant that we had to look into how we handle data, because we cannot control what our members want to do and not do with their data, but we can control what we can offer them as security for their data. So we've stood up a large data management and data governance systems, and we see that popping up over the industry as well. So more and more members are starting their own data governance paths to understand what data they have, how they're hosting it, what they're doing with the data, if they're doing enough with that data. I think it's not just understanding how we're sharing data, but also what data do we collect, and what is it usable for? So that was a big question that we've seen that in the early 2000s, it was just big collecting data, and then they sat on all those data sets and didn't know what to do with them, essentially. I think we're being more purposeful now, and having that data platform now helps us a lot, helps us bring in other researchers into our environment so that they can work on the data without the data leaving EPRI ever. And I think that helped with the security of data and members trusting us with their data.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you, Leah. So, David, do you want to?
Yeah. So maybe a more specialized question. I'd love to dive into something, sort of the technical pipeline involved. Ignacio, what are some of the technical challenges involved in Indigo's carbon program, and how much of it, connecting to the previous question, is data availability versus novel machine learning methods for remote sensing data and how much of that is also domain expertise. So I guess, data versus methods versus, or like ML, pure ML methods versus domain specific expertise. I think you're muted. It wouldn't be a COVID or a panel discussion if there wasn't somebody on mute at some point.
Sorry. So, there's a lot of challenges, but I would say this is almost like a mirage, right? Is the locality of the models means that you're always in a data scarce situation, right? So having enough, essentially labeled data or ground truth is one of the big challenges. And another challenge is to have, that I think we're doing really well, is to have a critical mass of domain expertise so you can interpret, as Sekou was saying, with context, essentially what's going on, and codify that in your models. So I think one of the biggest challenges is essentially structuring what are the experimental designs for ground truthing that helps you scale up and leverage remote sensing in situations where you can't really use in situ sensing. And I think the next layer of challenges goes back to what Sekou was alluding to, which is, creating a climate of an even resolution view of the world with data interoperability backing that, so you can actually find that long tail of common patterns at the global scale. Places that are very far from each other that look the same, that are subject to the same climate zones, soil types, same context. So these micro contexts that look unique, they're only unique because we are not zooming out. Things are a bit less original once you look at things with a global scale. But you do need a shared, unified scientific picture of what's going on. So you need some uniformity of depth on the data to be able to find those patterns. So I would say those are the challenges. How do you go global? How do you get training data? How do you codify domain knowledge scientifically, right? And so those are the big challenges. I think a fourth challenge will be uncertainty management and understanding that, because this is used for financial products. You need to, ultimately, these are financial bets, forms of insurance. So you cannot need those error bars, and they have to be principled. So, but that's almost a topic for another entire panel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And, on the research side, there is a lot of discussions of the bottlenecks, often involving uncertainty quantification, interpretability being another. This, really comes up again. And I think it's sort of really touched on a lot of what we've heard throughout the course of this week. As being something that's really essential to making sure that actually something gets deployed and used by end stakeholders and is really relevant. At this point, I also want to remind the audience that you should feel free to ask questions via the hop-in. We are drawing to a close, and we may not have that much time for that, but hopefully we can get to one or two.
Yeah, and I guess before audience members ask questions, let's I guess start wrapping up with a question of, like, what advice do all of you have for entrepreneurs and for established companies that want to become more involved in this space? Just whoever has the strongest opinion, go first. Maybe, I don't know, Sekou, how about you? What's your take?
Yeah, I can give it a shot. I don't know if it's the strongest opinion, but I do believe it. I would say that there are two things that are really pressing. One, develop AI with a purpose, not just for AI's sake, and make it trustworthy and transparent. And by purpose, we don't need another app, and I alluded to this before, that there's a generative model that puts some face on a celebrity's body, right? That kind of, granted, to use that machine learning model may not be very expensive, but to train that model, you could power some meaningful places. But the other element of that answer is, when you develop a model, make sure it's explainable. Publish the details, right? Share the data that you use to train it. Right? That's the only way we're going to get more and more people to buy in a timely manner. And I wouldn't be a person in tech if I also didn't talk about services. So you can drive or derive more impact if you develop tools in a way that others can use it as well, right? So if you have a new way to model how clouds are simulated in the troposphere, make sure that you can actually share that with somebody, not just that it runs in your laptop and that's the end of it, or it runs in your data center and that's the end of it. Right? Don't let it get buried.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you have another way to quantify uncertainty in a flood model, well, go talk to the fire prediction folks too, because they really need to understand uncertainty just as much as you do.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We have to do this together to get to the global targets, whether it's 2 degrees or, if you don't believe it can be done, 1.5 degrees. We have to do it together, right? So let's figure out how to make that happen.
Yeah, thank you, Sekou. And I think we have time for probably one more person to offer their perspective on this, advice for entrepreneurs and established companies who want to be more involved in this space. Who wants to go?
Well, since I'm working a lot with companies in that space, we're evaluating a lot of those. I think what I've seen lately is, apart from everything that Sekou just said, listening and bringing in industry experts. I've seen so many AI companies that want to go into the energy space. They have 0 expert engineers on their team, and that makes it really hard to communicate with the engineers on the other side and to transfer their ideas. And I think going in, listening to the industry, listening to their problems is quintessential. Don't develop the next gold wrapper for the software that nobody needs.
Yeah, thank you, Leah. And I guess to put a bit of a more positive spin on this, yeah, on one hand, we tech people need domain experts to have impact. But on the other hand, if you look at what the domain experts need, they need us tech people. Like, there are tons of companies that have experts but lack the good engineers to make, to package the ideas in a software platform, for example. So yeah, we have to work together on this, and it's going to be productive. Yeah, thank you so much, everybody.
That ties in with a question that we just got from the audience pretty nicely. So maybe Amy or Ignacio, if you wanna take this, how can someone without climate experience work on these problems? So what advice would you give to somebody who maybe doesn't have background on any of these relevant areas?
I think my advice is just take a deep breath and reflect on how long is a career, right? We're all going to work for 30, 40 years. Plan your career to spend sizable chunks of it learning from people who know more than you. It's very hard to tackle the big picture in your early years. Everybody wants to work on the big picture, and that's how we end up in the examples that Leah was bringing up, which is companies that get started to work on big problems, but they don't really know what they're talking about, right? So the advice is plan a lifelong path of learning. So if you want to learn about that, either go to school or go to work in a place where you can follow someone else's mission and support it and learn in the process. It's not going to happen overnight. It might take you a decade to learn the topic. And if you're not willing to spend a decade learning about the topic, then you shouldn't be working on it, right? So life is long. There's time to do it. And usually in the first half, you have to spend it preparing yourself, right? So I would say find a place where you can learn from someone, figure out how you can make that last a few years.
Amy, any additional thoughts there?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great comment. I guess I would add to that is, I guess it does make me think, what stage is this person in their career in asking that question? Yeah. So, I guess I have a slightly different take if you're a young person in the career. I mean, the advice I give to people who are often scientists who want to take a non-traditional path, to come to me and say, well, why did you do that? I guess my take on that is, don't plan your career. Make sure you're working on something that you're passionate about, and the next thing will come along. And if this is something you're passionate about, then great, and then go into it. But don't assume it's necessarily has to be your life mission, because things can change. But I guess the more important thing I would highlight, I think, is that I think that people don't have to make climate their life mission in terms of their core business. I think everybody has to make it their life mission in some ways. But I mean, in other words, it doesn't have to be their core business. But I think you can still be a contributor. And so one of the things that I've really focused in my life is to recognize that, this is my full-time job, to work on climate and sustainability, and it has been for 25 years, right? But what I want to do in helping to move that along is to allow people who it's not their full-time job but has something to contribute, to make that space for them to come in as an expert and share that expertise and feel reward from it, so that they come back and that they learn from it, from that experience. And so I think that there are opportunities to be, what is it that you're passionate about? What is it that component that you think you can learn about, but don't necessarily know that you know that? Talk to a lot of people, figure out what is that opportunity where you can engage, even if you don't have a full-time job. I'm not saying you shouldn't. I'm just saying you don't have to have a really big impact.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Amy. And yeah, we're pretty much at time. So yeah, this was an excellent panel. Thank you for your perspective on these questions, David. Any?
Yeah, I'm sorry that we can't get to more discussion, more questions. We apologies to the audience for that. We could clearly keep on going for quite a lot longer. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Thank you to all of our wonderful panelists, and thank you to everyone who tuned in for this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone, see you in the
It was
talks.
a pleasure.
Thank you.